Ladies and gentlemen, welcome you all, dear excellencies. I believe there are many ambassadors here tonight. A very warm welcome to all of you. My name is Monique Knapen, and I'm working as a director for the John Adams Institute. And as some of you might know already, the John Adams Institute brings already for quite some time remarkable, prominent American writers and thinkers to the Netherlands. Tonight, we are proud to have Robert Kagan as our guest. Thanks to the Dutch translation of Paradise and Power, made by publishing house De Bezige and the Atlantic Association, who did, I think, bring a lot of members to Amsterdam tonight, the John Adams Institute could arrange tonight's event. I'm glad so many of you took the time and forget about the football game tonight to come and listen to Robert Kagan and his views on the world, and that of the New World Order in particular. The layout of tonight's evening is as usual, as our usual John Adams evenings. We'll have an introduction. This time it's made by Leonard Ornstein. He's a journalist for the Dutch television news program Netwerk. He will briefly introduce Robert Kagan, and he will do that more profoundly than I can do that. After the introduction, Mr. Kagan will come to this lectern, I think, and he will speak for about 30, 40, maybe a little bit longer minutes. And without intermission, Leonard will then interview Mr. Kagan on the stage here. And then at a certain moment, you will be invited to participate in the debate and the discussion. And if you do, please use the microphones we have prepared for you, because then everybody can listen to you. I do hope we have a fruitful debate, and I think we're going to close off at 9:45, but it could be a little bit later, but no later than 10 o'clock, because other people have to go to Den Haag and to other places. And before Robert Kagan will sign then the books, and I hope you all buy the Dutch book tonight, De Bezige Bij, I will ask Atlantic Association Chairman Jan Hoekstra. Jan Hoekema. I'm getting confused here. I wrote this tonight already, Jan Hoekstra, somebody else. Yeah, well then I can ask you now to switch off your mobile phones, please, and enjoy the evening. And Leonard, may I ask you to take the floor?
Thank you, Monique. Welcome, Robert Kagan. You couldn't come at a better moment, because tonight we read in the paper that Colin Powell wants to punish France. And I can tell you that we Dutch had also a dispute with the French on an issue, drugs issue. And what the French did was they established a kind of work group, a kind of commission to try to ease the tension between the two countries. And today was the installation of this commission. And what did I hear? There were 87 of these commissions all over the world. So this is what will happen between the United States and France. A commission will solve all the problems. Of Paradise and Power, America versus Europe in the New World Order. Robert Kagan, our guest, is a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and a columnist for the Washington Post. Mr. Kagan, on behalf of the John Adams Institute, the publishing house, De Bezige Bij, and the Atlantic Commission, we are very happy and also honored to have you here in Amsterdam. All you say is that Americans are from Mars and we Europeans are from Venus. At the time of unprecedented dissent between the US leaders and their continental counterparts, Robert Kagan's book has made him one of the most popular theorists of our times. His study of Paradise and Power is the differing approaches to military strategy in the Western world. It's a work required reading for every ambassador, general, or political leader. Robert Kagan has achieved the rare feat of turning foreign policy into a real bestseller. In the footsteps of, let's say, the great George Kennan, who wrote in 1947 in Foreign Affairs his famous essay on containment policy, And in 50 years, Mr. Kagan, we will see, or you are as famous as he is. But I forecast that we won't forget for a long time your essay. Mr. Kagan is what we nowadays call a neoconservative. I do not know, or he considered it as a compliment. Here in the Netherlands, almost nobody calls himself a conservative. Conservative is something from Mars. We will discuss that later. Bob Kagan collaborated on a book together with William Crystal, the other famous neoconservative advocate of American foreign policy of unilateralism. Let me try to summarize Mr. Kagan's thoughts and ideas in a few sentences. And I quote from his book: "It is time to stop pretending that Europeans and Americans share a common view of the world, or even that they occupy the same world. On all the all-important questions of power, the efficacy of power, the morality of power, the desirability of power, American and European perspectives are diverging. Europe is turning away from power, or to put it in a little differently, it is moving beyond power into a self-contained world of laws and rules and transnational negotiation and cooperation. It is entering a post-historical paradise of peace and relative prosperity, the realization of Kant's perpetual peace. The United States, meanwhile, remains mired in history, exercising power in a jungle where international laws and rules are unreliable. Military might in the world of Hobbes is the word." There were many reactions on your book. For example, his small book is a big book. Nothing has been written since the death of Raymond Aron, wrote Leon Wiesenthaler in the New York Times. And in the same paper, François IJsboer, directeur Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique based in Paris, quoted on Kagan, "No academic piece in this realm has generated quite as much heat and interest since Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, or Francis Fukuyama's End of History in 1989. The same Francis Fukuyama himself needed for your work just one word: brilliant. And Henry Kissinger wrote, "Though in the past we have disagreed, I consider this essay one of those seminal treatises without which any discussion of European-American relations would be incomplete, and which will shape that discussion for years to come." Former Secretary of State George Shultz, of whom Kagan was speechwriter, said, "This refreshing essay results from careful thought combined with critical information." There were many compliments for this book, also from Europe. Pascal Lamy, the European Trade Commissioner, thinks Mr. Kagan has it right. He said, "Stop pretending that the United States and Europe share a common view of the world. Recognize we have different worldviews and interests, and then manage our relations." But of paradise and power is criticized by many. For example, by Christoph Bertram von der Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik in Berlin. He takes a critical view of Kagan's explanations and arguments. And he writes, according to Bertram, the difference between Europe and America is not weakness, but Europe's lack of strategic ambition. That's the problem. International threats. Bertram wrote, if there are international threats, Europe has no policy at all. Tony Judd, in the New York Review of Books, was critical. He said, Kagan has forgotten the very recent past in which European infantrymen on peacekeeping missions in Asia, Africa and Europe got killed. I don't want to discuss Srebrenica, but it could have been an argument for Mr. Kagan to strengthen and to oppose Mr. Judd. But here in the Netherlands there was also criticism, for example, by commentator Paul Scheffer. He mentioned Kagan's book, A Caricature, and referred to the commitment of the US to international institutions. Bart Tromp, professor on international relations, reminded us that a minimal majority in Congress supported President Bush in 1991 to start a war. It was Margaret Thatcher who convinced the American president. Ladies and gentlemen, Robert Kagan, according to me, wrote a magnificent, fascinating and provocative essay. But I have still some questions. How much are the United States, in his view, still committed and dedicated to international institutions like the United Nations and NATO? And I want to quote President Harry Truman, who said on the 16th of April 1945, in an address before a joint session of the Congress, the President said, "While great states have a special responsibility to enforce the peace, their responsibility is based upon the obligations resting upon all states, large and small, not to use force in international relations except in the defense of law. The responsibility of the great states is to serve and not to dominate the world. Even the most experienced pilot," the President said, "cannot bring a ship safely into harbor unless he has the full cooperation of the crew." And the President finished his address by saying, "I appeal every American, regardless of party, race or color, to support our efforts to build a strong and lasting United Nations." Mr. Kagan, I hope we will discuss on the United Nations. I hope you, in your contribution, will give us a broader view on your views. Thank you for coming. The floor is to you.
Well, thank you very much, Leonard, for that mixed introduction. No, I'm kidding. You actually didn't read all the really nasty criticisms that have been written about me, so I'm very grateful to you for that. It's a great honor for me to be here. This is a wonderful institution that does extremely important work, and Monique, you and your colleagues deserve enormous credit for what you're doing here, and I really appreciate being invited to this institution, and as well as by the co-sponsors. I will try to be brief because I understand there's a football match on, and I don't want to, there's nothing worse, at least in my experience, than my speaking while you all wish to be watching a game. I don't know whether you were going to show it on the screen or not. So that might work, if you, those of you who want to watch and can watch. I wrote the original article that this book is based on. I actually wrote it more than a year and a half ago, probably at the end of 2002. And when I was writing it and when it first came out, I must say that the general reaction, or at least a lot of the immediate reaction, was, what are you making such a big deal about this split in the transatlantic relationship? I mean, we've seen these kinds of splits before. So the general criticism was, you're really making a mountain out of a molehill here. And I must say, having lived through the subsequent 18 months, I find myself shocked at how bad things actually got. I was surprised, even with the analysis that I had presented, I was surprised to see how bad the transatlantic relationship got, and in a way is still in. I must say I'm in print predicting in the summer of last year that the French would eventually come along into the Iraq intervention, and I believed that for quite some time, as I think did Tony Blair, as I think did George Bush, and for all I know, as did Jacques Chirac. But in any case, that's not the way things worked out. And what we saw emerge, quite obviously, was just an enormous gulf between Americans and Europeans. And I want to emphasize that it was a gulf between Americans and Europeans. It was not simply a gulf between George W. Bush and Gerhard Schroeder, or George W. Bush and Jacques Chirac. The polls on both sides of the Atlantic could not have been clearer in the months leading up to the war, during the war, and even after the war. Something like 70% of Americans supported the war. Something more than 80% of Europeans opposed the war. What could be a clearer indication of what we all felt? But surely that is a rather striking phenomenon. And I would say that part of the crisis that we have had has been a kind of mutual shock at this breadth of this disagreement, that there should be such a large majority of the United States supporting this war and such a large majority of Europeans I think part of the reason that this has been so upsetting is because we've all woken up as if we've woken into a bad dream. I liken us to a married couple that wakes up one morning and takes a look at each other and says, "You're not the person I married." Europeans were shocked to see this America emerge, and I can assure you that as an American, Americans were just as shocked to see this Europe emerge. And I think it's important for Europeans to understand how broad the sentiment is in the United States, because I read in European papers that this is all, you mentioned the term neoconservative, this is a neoconservative conspiracy. And you should feel fortunate, because in this room you have 20% of the entire neoconservative movement, as far as I'm able to count. There may be 6 or 7 neoconservatives, and according to European theory, 6 or 7 people took charge of the entire apparatus of American foreign policy and steered it in a very odd direction that it wouldn't have gone in. Or Europeans believe that it's George W. Bush and his some kind of evangelical messianism. And there's an equivalent view in the United States, that it's Gerhard Schroeder wanted to get elected, or Jacques Chirac is on an ego trip. And I must say, there's truth in all of these things, but I really think that all of this avoids perhaps what is a deeper and more frightening problem, which is that it's not about single politicians, and it's not about a single group of people. It is about fundamental, deep-seated, historically evolved, ideological differences that have emerged between Americans and Europeans in recent years. And that's the subject of my book, and that's what I'd like to talk about within the constraints of the football match today. What is the source of this, what I believe is deep-seated disagreement? There are fundamentally 2 elements of the gap in worldview that has opened up between the United States and Europe. There is a structural element, and there is an ideological element. The structural element has to do with the enormous gap that we all know has opened up in terms of sheer military power. We have the United States, which is far and away the most powerful nation the world has ever seen in military terms, although if you add up economic and soft power as well as military power, then in some respects it's even more powerful. And you have a Europe which, while stronger than the rest of the world, or most of the rest of the world, in relative terms, relative to the United States, has become militarily weak. It has been, in relative terms, militarily weaker than the United States for quite some time, but the gap has actually grown over recent years, and partly because of technological developments in American military capacity, which Europeans have not been keeping up with. Now, this is not a mechanistic issue. It's not simply that there is this gap, because flowing from this gap are all kinds of ramifications, psychological ramifications, attitudes towards international order, attitudes towards threats. And I think we have to recognize that there are certain realities, it seems to me, about human history and human existence that differentiates the way very strong powers feel compared to the way weaker powers feel. For instance, it seems to me axiomatic that those who have more military power tend to use it more, tend to believe in the legitimacy of military power more. Those who have less tend to wish to resort to it less. Tend to believe less in its legitimacy, and in fact tend to believe in trying to create a world where military power is not that important. It stands to reason. And I think it's important to recognize this, because the differences between the United States and Europe are not differences of historical culture that go back centuries. They're relatively recent, and part of the difference is this shift in the military balance. When the United States was a weak and vulnerable country at the end of the 18th century and the early 19th century, if you go back and you read the statements of American diplomats, you will hear a lot of talk about the importance of international law, about the obsolescence of military power, a lot of criticism of European power politics as something that had to be moved beyond. Americans talked about the importance of commerce as the soothing balm of international relations. Americans were the great champions of the international laws of the seas. And who was the great opponent of the international law of the seas in those days? The British Navy, which was dominant and didn't want to be constrained by international legal mechanisms. Those were the years when the Americans were calling for international legal norms, and Europeans were talking about realpolitik and Macht politik and raison d'etat. And so here we are 200 years later, and the military balance is completely reversed, and not shockingly, so have attitudes towards the international order. Great, strong powers have less enthusiasm for international legal mechanisms that may constrain them than smaller powers who hope to use those international legal mechanisms to constrain the greater powers. This is not, I want to make clear, in my view, this is not good versus evil. This is just a certain reality. I'm not making a moral judgment about who's right, but these are certain realities that we have to recognize. And similarly, on the questions of threats and how you deal with threats, it doesn't surprise me that Europeans have different attitudes towards threats than Americans do. Because, again, it has to do, to some extent, not entirely, but to some extent with the available power that one has. If there are threats out there that you can't do anything about, what is the normal human reaction to that? To try to put them out of your mind. If you can't solve a problem, there's no point in worrying about it too much. It's a natural human tendency. And I think there's a dynamic that exists in international relations and human relations in general, where those who can do something about a threat are more likely not only to do something about it, but to find that threat less tolerable. I use an analogy in the book which I will never cease to regret, and not even sure I want to bring it up here because whenever you use one of these analogies, people have variations on the analogy. But if there are two people and there's a bear in the forest, the person with a knife is less likely to want to take on that bear than the person with the rifle. In fact, the person with the rifle is more likely to consider the bear's threat intolerable because there's something he can do about it. Whereas the person who does not have the rifle is more likely to tolerate the bear because there is nothing he can do about it. So I think these questions of power do have all kinds of psychological ramifications and philosophical ramifications in the real world. But that is not the only thing that divides the United States and Europe. It is not just the military power gap. Reinforcing that gap, strengthening the durability of that gap is an important ideological gap as well. And I think that ideological gap is the product of history that we all know very well, and especially in Europe. Europe, in recent years, has accomplished something that I consider to be like a geopolitical miracle. The European Union, the peace that has been achieved on the European continent, is something that we really have never seen before, certainly in European history and arguably in world history. European nations, in their dealings with one another, have essentially put military power aside. Military power does not play a role in the international system that Europe has created for itself. The prospects of one large European power going to war with the other are almost non-existent. It's almost unimaginable. And this is a miracle, and it's a fantastic accomplishment. It's something Americans in particular should be extremely grateful for, because America has, of course, lost lives in European wars. There is no greater strategic benefit to the United States than a Europe at peace. And the methods that Europe has used to develop this order, the methods of the means of international relations, negotiations, legal mechanisms. The European Union is one large legal institution. It's one large functioning multilateral institution. And Europeans have developed a great attachment, and understandably so, to the methods by which they've accomplished this great miracle of geopolitics. And also, not surprisingly, it seems to me, having discovered this great secret to human happiness, Europeans now wish to see this miracle exported beyond the borders of Europe, to apply the lessons that they've learned through their own bloody history to the problems of the world. That conflicts can be settled through negotiation and persuasion and compromise and through economic engagement and not through military force. The Europeans have a mission. And I must say, as an American, we Americans ought to understand that impulse very well, because Americans themselves believed 200 years ago and more that they discovered the key to human happiness and have spent more than 200 years trying to spread that to the rest of the world. And so here we have a European mission and we have an American mission, but they're not the same mission. And that may be part of our problem. Because the Americans have not gone through the historical evolution that Europeans have gone through. Americans remember World War II as the good war. That's the phrase they used to describe it. That's the war where American power came to the rescue of humanity. Europeans have a different memory of World War II, as I gather. So even beginning from that starting point, there is a difference of perspective. And for 50 years, 60 years, and more, Americans have continued to believe not that the world must move beyond military power, but that military power is an essential adjunct of successful diplomacy. It's an unavoidable reality of international relations. Military power won World War II, military power won the Cold War, military power won the first Gulf War. It's not that Americans love to go to war, it's not that Americans are a warrior people, but the difference between Americans and Europeans is the greater belief today of Americans that military power is still an essential element of the international system. And in fact, more than that, Americans believe, as they have believed since the end of the Second World War, that American military power is the essential underpinning of the international order. You've read from Harry Truman, and the statements of the United States regarding the United Nations and the founding of this international system, the rhetoric is beautiful and moving. I urge you to read what Dean Acheson thought about the United Nations. And no one was a more founder of the American foreign policy after the Second World War than Dean Acheson. Dean Acheson did not believe in the United Nations. Dean Acheson once said, "America is the locomotive of Western civilization and the rest of the world is the caboose." That's a quote. Dean Acheson believed in American military power and American economic power as the essential underpinning of the international system, and pretty much every American administration since the end of the Second World War has believed the same, right up until Bill Clinton declared that the United States was the indispensable nation. And so the American view of the international order places America at the center of it, and that has been the case since the Second World War, and it's the case today as well. And so how different is that perspective, obviously, from the European perspective? Now, the end of the Cold War really did have a dramatic effect which accelerated the opening of the gap between the United States and Europe. And it's important to remember, as we reflect now on American behavior, what were the explanations for American behavior during the Cold War and also for European behavior. In the Cold War strategy in the United States was about Europe to a very large extent. It was also about Asia, but fundamentally it was about Europe. And when you talk about the multilateralism of the United States during the Cold War, well, of course there was multilateralism. There was an imperative for multilateralism. Victory in the Cold War or success in the Cold War was intimately and inextricably bound up with the American relationship with Europe. So it seems to me natural that when the Cold War ended, that this multilateral imperative would diminish somewhat, that the sense that American foreign policy was about Europe, which was so strong during the Cold War, would diminish as well. And the end of the Cold War changed things in Europe too. Because American hegemony, the enormous extent of American power is not entirely new. It was also true during the Cold War, but Europeans accepted American hegemony, sometimes unhappily, sometimes happily, but they accepted it again for the same reason. We were all bound up together in the face of this common threat. And we all spoke in those days during the Cold War of something called the West. In the Cold War, we were all defending the West. The Soviet Union was a challenge to the West. When the Soviet Union disappeared, could we really talk, at least in strategic terms, about the West? I think the answer has been no. And it's been no on both sides of the Atlantic. Because when the Cold War ended, what was the issue in Europe? Not the West, the issue was Europe. And in the United States, the issue was something else. It was, maybe a little bit in Europe, maybe a little bit in Asia, but it wasn't the West. And so the things that bound us together during the Cold War and allowed us to overlook some of these structural differences and ideological differences, they disappeared. And so I find it not surprising, whether you lament it or not, I find it not surprising that America has become more unilateralist in the post-Cold War world. Nor do I find it surprising that there has been what you might call a rising European nationalism at the end of the Cold War, and a perception on the part of Europe that they didn't need the United States, and a perception on the part of the United States that the protection of Europe was no longer the top priority. And then if you get to September 11th and the effect of September 11th, which completely inverted the entire Cold War dynamic. The Cold War was about the United States being willing to risk itself to defend Europe against an attack that would occur in Europe. And here was an attack that occurred over the heads of Europe onto American soil in a way that did not involve the Allies at all. Again, what could be less surprising than that the United States at this point would become more unilateralist, more self-centered, more concerned only about its own security and less about the attitudes and feelings of the rest of the world. I say all this not because I want to excuse anyone's behavior. I think there have been plenty of errors on all sides. But I do think that the key to moving forward, to repairing as best as possible the relationship between the United States and Europe, lies in at least beginning to recognize that these differences do exist, that we can't ignore them anymore, and that we have to get over the shock of recognizing that we differ in this way. Now, where do we go from here? I don't think it's possible to do away with these enormous structural and ideological gaps. I think they're with us to stay. But if you want to go back to the marriage analogy, I also don't think divorce is one of the options. Because the truth is it's a cliche, but it really is true, that the economic ties and the political ties and the cultural ties between the United States and Europe are too great for there to be a complete severing of the relationship. What we do have is a fundamental difference in worldview on these fundamental strategic and military questions, which is not going away. The question now is not whether we can obliterate the gap, but whether we can manage the gap, whether we can build a strategic partnership that accepts the fact that we have these differences. We can't go back to the old Cold War strategic partnership because the international circumstances that made that strategic partnership possible no longer exist. But perhaps we can forge a new strategic partnership based on present realities. And here there is room for what one might call statesmanship on both sides of the Atlantic. Obviously, the United States needs to have what the Founding Fathers called a decent respect for the opinion of mankind. And it has to move out of a self-centered mode, even in this crisis, because one of the things that this crisis has forced this administration to do, in some ways against its original intentions, is to become a world leader again. That in fighting this war on terrorism and in dealing with the aftermath of September 11th, and in addressing the problems that the President Bush wants to address, requires once again world leadership, which means to some extent the United States has to go back to the old bargain in a way with its partners around the world and take their interests seriously too and take their concerns seriously as well and not just think about what America needs and what America wants. At the same time, it seems to me Europe has a very important role to play for itself. There are things that Europe must do not only to rebuild a new kind of partnership, but also for itself. It seems to me that although the reasons why Europe has tried to move beyond military power are easily understood, very easily understood, nevertheless, it seems to me that Europe made a bad bet after the end of the Cold War in believing that economic power alone was going to create the kind of geopolitical influence that Europe wants to have in the world. And the notion that Europe can pursue its mission of international order without military power is a great mistake. I mean, one of the crucial differences perhaps between Americans and Europeans is in their assessment of where mankind stands today on the continuum between the laws of the jungle and the laws of reason. Europeans are much more optimistic, it seems to me, that we have really almost approached the stage where military force is almost not necessary and where you can rely on an international legal system for security. Americans are more skeptical of that. I'm an American, therefore I think Europeans are making a mistake. And that while the system that they have created for themselves in Europe is a miracle, the rest of the world is not Europe. and that the way that Europeans deal with each other is not the way that they can deal with Saddam Hussein and Kim Jong-il and many others around the world who pose a threat. And that if the Europeans want to have influence, they are still going to have military power. And in their dealing with the United States, because now for the first time really, Europe needs a foreign policy toward the United States. And in fact, that is what is being wrestled over today in Europe. In dealing with the United States, I believe it's in Europe's interest to bring more military power to the table. Not just, as Americans like to say, so that they can be a better partner with the United States, which of course is desirable for Americans, but also so that they can have the kind of influence they want to have over the United States. They can't match American military power, but more military effectiveness and capability, even at the margins, can make, it seems to me, a big difference. And right now, Europe seems to be confronted with two fundamental choices on how to deal with the United States: the Chirac approach and the Blair approach. It seems to me that the Chirac, you will not be surprised to hear me say that I don't think the Chirac approach is the right approach, but I also think that it should be clear to Europeans that from the European perspective, the Chirac approach of trying to create a check, trying to create Europe as a check and opposition to American power, not only will not work ultimately, but it also divides Europe. That you cannot build a unified Europe around a policy of opposing the United States and turning Europe into a counterweight to the United States. And it seems to me that Blair's approach of trying to be a strong and effective partner when there's agreement, but in any case being willing to work with the United States and bringing a lot to the table when that comes, is more likely to influence the United States in the ways that Europeans want to influence the United States. Because if European policy is to try to rope the United States as much as possible into this international order that Europeans are trying to create, I don't think they're going to accomplish that goal through Chirac's method. And they have a much better chance of accomplishing that goal through Blair's method. So I want to end on a relatively optimistic note, and this is partly because I'm a nostalgic, just like many of us here, for the Cold War and the old relationship. This is one of those situations where my brain tells me one thing, but my heart tells me something else. I would like to think there is a future for this transatlantic relationship. I think it's important. As an American, I don't like the idea of going it alone. I don't trust American judgment so much that I think that there is no one else who can give us some useful advice and warnings about how we might go about our business. I would like to see the United States and Europe work closely together again. And I do believe it's possible not to fix all our problems, but to manage them more effectively than we have in the past. So on that note, I say thank you very much. Do you want me here?
Well, welcome.
Thanks.
Behind the table here in the beautiful church. You made a world tour, and I understood your book is translated into Japanese, Spanish, Israel. I don't know how many countries are interested in your views. What is interesting also to ask you is, are you now a neocons, yes or no?
Are you now, or have you ever been a neoconservative, I think is the way that... You know, this is going to be more than your audience wants to hear, but by the strict definition of a neoconservative, the answer is no, because the strict definition of a neoconservative was someone in the 1970s who used to be a Trotskyist who became a conservative, and I've never been a Trotskyist, therefore I can't be a neoconservative. But neoconservative, obviously, in Europe has taken on enormous connotations, which I think are a little bit absurd. But if I had to define what I conceive to be neoconservatism, it is the belief that American power should be used to build an international order where the liberal principles that Americans believe in can flourish. I don't consider that to be a very radical doctrine. In fact, I consider that to be the fundamentally traditional policy of the United States over the years.
If you nowadays hear the kind of conspiracy theories about Wolfowitz plans and things like that to change dictatorships, to change the world, what is your view on that?
Well, I have two views on that. One is that I think that this sort of tendency that I find in Europe to leap to the conspiracy theory explanation for American foreign policy in a way avoids what may be the harsher reality or the more troubling reality, which is that the policy that has been carried out has the overwhelmingly broad support of the American people and bipartisan support, and has had bipartisan support. And in a way, that may be a more troubling reality for Europeans than to think that 5 people somehow hijacked American policy, and that's how to explain it. When I hear Europeans being shocked to discover that America is claiming that it's going to be spreading democracy around the world, I really have to ask myself, where have Europeans been for the last 150 years?
Well, a long time we were away. Yeah.
It isn't as if America hasn't been hypocritical in its claim to be spreading democracy around the world. It has. But the idea that America would proclaim it as its mission to spread democracy, that's not really new. Nor is it new for America to be expanding its strategic purview and its power around the world. I mean, if one just steps back for a second, one would see a nation that has been expanding its territory and its strategic influence consistently for about 300 years. And this may be only the latest example of what has been a very long-term American policy, and I feel that somehow Europeans have come to the point where they're unwilling to remember that history.
Is that why you are also a member of this famous project for a new American century?
Yes, that's why I am, because I have a plot. It's a plot to take over the whole world.
But what is it?
Well,
This project?
The Project for the New American Century is a group of 3 people.
Oh, that's really a conspiracy.
It's really... Well, what's a better conspiracy? In that case, you have 33% of the Project for the New American Century here. With the extremely revolutionary goal of fostering American involvement around the world in the interests of American principles. That's been our mission, and we're proud of it.
And who are the other 2 members?
The other 2 members are Bill Kristol, the other neoconservative, that makes 40% of the whole neoconservative movement, and a guy named Gary Schmidt, who has yet to become as famous in Europe as he deserves to be.
Okay.
And a secretary.
Now, let's try to come to more serious business.
Who's different.
Bob.
I would name her, but she's different. They've rotated over the past 6 years.
And with Bob Kristol, you wrote a book together, eh?
Yes.
In 1990. Well, let's try to get a little bit more to serious business. In American history, you have a tradition of George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson. Let's call them the realists. And then you have, I see immediately you disagree with me, you have Woodrow Wilson, you have Roosevelt, you have Truman, you have Kennedy, and you have Carter, who are more the idealistic American presidents. You are making a watershed between the EU and the United States, but it's not a real watershed between the EU, between the Europeans from Venus and the neocons and the Republicans.
Well, there's 2 questions in that question, and so I don't actually agree in your characterization of American presidents, but maybe okay. I should skip that part. Yeah. I actually think that American foreign policy has always been informed by idealism, and that was true of Washington, and it was true of Alexander Hamilton, and it was certainly true of Jefferson, who's rarely described as a realist. He's usually described as a proto-Wilsonian. But in any case, I think that the choices have been between wild and woolly-headed idealism and what I would call practical idealism. But there's always been idealism. And I'll tell you why. I mean, it's worth maybe just a second. Every nation's foreign policy reflects the nation in some way. And it's important, I think, to remember, as I'm sure many of you don't need to be told, that the essence of American nationhood is the principles of the Declaration of Independence. The belief in that, in God-given or nature-given, however you want to do it, natural, universal rights. And at the heart of American nationalism is an internationalism, because Americans have always believed that the rights that they enjoy are the rights that all people should enjoy. And so there's always been this, I don't like the term missionary, but there's always been this idealistic strain in American foreign policy. And if you go back and read the statements of the Founding Fathers, every single one of them, every one that you quoted, there was a great belief in the great destiny of the United States to itself become powerful, but also as a means of spreading this great ideal. Jefferson talked of an empire of liberty. Jefferson. Alexander Hamilton talked about this Hercules in a cradle, this embryo of a great empire. I mean, the sense of greatness, of worldwide greatness, was always a major part of the American idea, and it was a greatness based on the greatness of the American principles. I mean, this is just a reality. This is why people talk about American exceptionalism. Yeah? Okay, yeah. Now, so aren't you sorry you asked me that question? On the subject of is this Republican foreign policy, yes, which is really what you're saying, I have to say that this is a serious error of analysis, and it's necessary not only to talk about the current situation, but also the recent past. The current that the resolution in the Senate authorizing war against Iraq passed 78 to 22, which actually, as you pointed out, or you quoted someone pointing out, is much higher than the resolution that passed the first Gulf War. You had a much greater number of Democrats supporting this war than supported the first Gulf War. If you go through the list of American presidential candidates on the Democratic side, the contenders for the Democratic nomination, I think it's something like 3 of the leading candidates have all endorsed the war, voted for it in the case of John Kerry, and been very vigorously in favor of it in the case of John Edwards and Joe Lieberman. So the people most likely to be the Democratic candidate in the next election at this moment are people who favored the war. If you look at the polls and divide the polls between Republicans and Democrats, more Republicans supported the war than Democrats did, but a majority of Democratic voters supported the war. Now, if you go back, that's the current situation. If you go back to the 1990s, we didn't see what would have happened if there'd been a Democratic administration elected in 2000. But if you go back to the late 1990s, first of all, Clinton did almost go to war with Iraq in February 98, did launch what was described at the time as a massive bombing attack on Iraq at the end of 1998, did support a missile defense program that was essentially aimed at Iraq, did support the legislation in Congress which was supposed to be providing arms to oppositions to Iraqi officials. What I want to say is that if September 11th had happened and Al Gore had been president, first of all, his vice president would have been Joe Lieberman, who was one of the leading anti-Saddam hawks in America. And second of all, I believe that it's entirely possible, and I've talked to many Democratic officials, senior Clinton administration officials, who agree it's entirely possible that maybe not at this exact moment and maybe not in this exact way, but that eventually they would have gone to war with Iraq. So this is a mistake.
Okay, now by saying this, I want to quote former President Clinton, who last week spoke at a seminar of governance by the conference board. And the former president said, if you got an interdependent world and you cannot kill, jail or occupy all your adversaries sooner or later, you will have to make a deal. And I want to quote also former President Clinton. Our paradigm now seems to be something terrible happened to us on 9/11, and this gives us the right to interpret all future events in a way that everyone else in the world must agree us. He said also, Washington overacted to German and French opposition to the US plans for military action against Iraq. It gives me the feeling that President Clinton would have definitely followed another policy than this administration.
But you neglect to quote where Clinton supported the war, which he did do. And in fact went to Britain to support Tony Blair, who was also supporting the war. I mean, and by the way, I agree with Clinton that the Bush administration overreacted to the French and the German opposition to the war. I mean, I just think that if you want to harbor this illusion, you may continue to do so, but it's going to lead to errors. If the European calculation is that their only problem is Republican presidents, they're going to make a mistake. I think it's obvious. The term hyperpower, coined by Foreign Minister Védrine, when was that term coined? And it was not meant as praise. It was meant as a complaint against this overbearing American power. It was coined during the Clinton years. When was this, the term the Europeans used to use was the hectoring hegemon. The big disputes that eventually became storms during the Bush administration, many of them began during the Clinton administration. The missile defense program that Europeans were so upset about, Bill Clinton began it. At the end of in the 2000 presidential campaign, Bush and Gore were arguing about the defense budget, trying to outbid each other as to which one would increase the defense budget more. And in fact, Gore won the bidding, because he promised to increase the defense budget by $100 billion over 10 years.
But can you explain me then why President Clinton didn't start a real war in 1998? He started bombing, I agree. He started to stop Saddam Hussein in a way, but he didn't go into Baghdad like this president was going.
He was afraid of the political consequences of going to that war. I hope you don't think that it was because he had a principled opposition to sending in ground troops to Iraq as opposed to just bombing the heck out of it. That wasn't because he had some... Well, for instance, when he did bomb Iraq, he did so explicitly without a UN Security Council authorization. So I hope you don't think it was that Clinton had such great respect for the UN Security Council that he was unwilling to take action. I'm not saying there's no difference, and there are certainly important stylistic differences. And it's possible that things would have happened differently if you'd had a different president. But the essence of the analysis, that this is just about George Bush, I'd like to assure you, is a mistake, and it will lead to misjudgments on the part of Europeans in the future.
Now, I maybe also remember you that it were the Europeans who, in 1995, said to President Clinton, now is the moment to go into Bosnia.
No, and I agree. It's not my argument, it has never been my argument that the Europeans are always unwilling to use force, and it was certainly the case that both Americans and Europeans had a very mixed record in the Balkans, and there were times when some Europeans were more aggressive about using force and putting troops in harm's way than the Americans were. I don't think there's any doubt about it. But if you look over the long stretch, even the short stretch of the past 13 years, when the Americans have gone to war 6, 7, or 8 times, and you listen to the way European leaders talk today, I don't think that you can doubt that there's a different perspective.
Now, going to the base of all your ideas, this power reflex. Why Americans have a kind of power reflex which we Europeans doesn't have?
Well, you Europeans did have it at one time.
But we lost it.
I mean, obviously, the answer is mostly a question of history. I mean, Europeans having had the power reflex operating quite effectively for the first half of the 20th century, having suffered through the horrors of those wars, decided that they wanted to escape that horror. And as I say, it's a wonderful thing that they have. But American experience has not been the same experience. And their memory of World War II is not the same. And their conviction that their power is a critical element of international order remains very much a part of America's psyche today.
And does it have something to do with your, let's say, technological superiority if you compare it to the Europeans?
Well,
is that not a very important element of it?
It has exacerbated the problem because Americans who are perhaps even more shy about casualties, although I think that sometimes the assertion that Americans won't take casualties has been overstated, but let's say that it is maybe even more than Europeans, have done what Americans have always done. They've come up with a technological answer to the problem. And it has made, the technological advances of the United States has made it more willing to use force in more situations. There's no question about it.
But as, to quote some of the people I did already, the peacekeeping missions, it were Europeans who suffered also a lot and were sending their troops inside Bosnia, were going all over the world, were not afraid to making the body bags. And that's a problem. The United States, every casualty is a real problem in the States. We even saw it in this war.
Well, I think that, again, that's overstated. I mean, if you look at the polls for what it's worth, the American people were expecting much higher casualties when they expressed their support for this war than they ultimately got. I don't think we should hold it against the Americans that they can fight a war with low casualties. But I do think that it's not as if, and peacekeeping is something that the Europeans are willing to do, and in many respects the Americans are not willing to do. But on the question of, are you willing to seek to use force as a solution to a problem, Europe's ability to engage in peacekeeping does not translate into an ability to launch the initial attack. And it's America's ability to launch the initial attack and to be the sharp end of the spear, or whatever the terminology is, that makes it more willing to use military force than Europeans do. I mean, the problem is Europeans' ability to project force overseas is far too limited for them to want to undertake those kinds of operations. They can come in behind American forces, but they can't launch the attack, and therefore they're less willing to launch the attack.
So, taking now part of the Europeans, the British, are they, according to you, from the planet Mars?
No, they must be from some different planet. They must be from the asteroid belt or something between...
But how do you explain? Because this is for me really one of the interesting spots. You said already something about Tony Blair. But can you explain the position of the British people in this?
Well, I mean, clearly the British posture has been the weakness and the refutation of the thesis that I advanced. I freely admit it, that I was wrong.
Finally, I got it.
Good, you win. But I don't know exactly where it goes, because one thing I note, obviously, is that the British public opinion for a long time was not that different from the rest of European public opinion.
Nowadays we see the same. The British weren't supporting this war.
No, I know. After the war, once it was successful, but leading up to the war, British opinion was essentially the same as European opinion. And I must say, in my discussions with British foreign policy intellectuals and even British officials, I didn't find much to distinguish their views from the views that I heard on the continent. So, and I think that Tony Blair may be one of those. One way to look at it is that Tony Blair is special. The other way to look at it, and somebody reminded me, is that Britain has been with the United States on every military mission going back as far as you can go. And I think that with the exception of the Australians, they're the only ones who have always been with the United States on everything. So I can only say that obviously Britain is not quite the same as the Europeans, and they'd be the first to say that that's true also. But what can I tell you? It's the outlier. It's the outlier of the thesis.
And the French position.
I mean, if you want, I know a lot of people will tell you that it's English, it's Anglo-Saxon nations that are somehow special in this regard. I don't know that I would be willing to. I don't know how far I would take that.
And how do you explain the French position, for example?
Well,
because you know what happened after 9/11. Le Monde wrote this famous article, "We are all Americans." What went wrong between the French and the Americans?
It was not just the French. I mean, all of Europe was sympathetic to the United States.
But Chirac went to New York with his helicopter. He flew over the city, giving all signs of solidarity. Something went wrong a few months later.
Well, I mean, the first answer is clearly, just because people were sympathetic to what happened on September 11th didn't translate into their support for everything that the United States was going to do thereafter. And as I recall it, there was tremendous unease in Europe, even at the same time that there was great sympathy for how the United States would respond to September 11th. Would they lash out? And then there was a great sense of comfort in Europe that Bush seemed to move very slowly and deliberately. And there was support in Europe for the Afghan war up to a point, because as the war was dragging on and not seeming to be successful, European support for the war was declining. But then it happened, it ended quickly enough, and that was fine. You know, clearly where the change came is when the Bush administration made it clear that there were further actions that were going to be taken, and the turning point clearly was the axis of evil speech. But nothing could illustrate to me in some ways better the differences in the worldview of Europeans and Americans than their reaction to the axis of evil speech. Because to Americans, the president saying there's an axis of evil, there was nothing controversial about that particularly. Americans understand that language. They use that language all the time. Ronald Reagan had called the Soviet Union an evil empire. This was a conscious reference to that statement. But in Europe, the axis of evil was greeted with horror and fear and concern about what would happen next. Now, I will leave it to some future historian to explain exactly what changed the French from not from that point, but from the moment that they agreed to 1441 and to the point where they ultimately slipped off of 1441. I can't explain that. It's a very difficult thing. There's a lot of factors going on. Clearly, Chirac was some of it was political, but I think some
personal.
Of it,
I
some
heard
of it was
that
personal.
This meeting between Bush and Chirac last year was a disaster.
Well, and I've heard that it's personal between Chirac and Schroeder. That there was that the great meeting between on the 40th anniversary that created a whole kind of dynamic vis-a-vis Schroeder and Chirac. I mean, I'm sure you've heard dozens of explanations. But look, underlying all of this, I really believe you have to take seriously the underlying issues here.
Is it anti-Americanism? Is it anti-Americanism? Is it French pacifism? Is it a French way of acting? What is moving the French?
You know, I hate to say this, but I actually think that France is France's statement of principles needs to be taken seriously. I mean, maybe that's the dumbest thing any foreign policy analyst could say, that it isn't just cynicism. The French claim to be wanting to do something to create a check against this unchecked power, which happens to be the United States. Therefore, I don't think the primary motive is anti-Americanism. I think it is, and you can tell me that it's all cynical, but I think it is genuine concern on the part of Chirac that the United States is too powerful, that after the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union disappeared, there was no one left to check it, and that the United States cannot be trusted to make all these decisions for the rest of the world, and that somebody needs to stand up and provide that check against the United States, and it should be a Europe led by France. And in voicing this opinion, he was speaking not only for the vast majority of the French people who agree, but also for the vast majority of Europeans in all countries who agree. So I think that this is not just pettiness, although there's certainly pettiness involved, and it's not just politics, although there's certainly politics involved, but there is an issue of principle here. Right. And in fact, although I don't agree with the French approach, there is an actual problem in a way, because we do have a new international situation that is unprecedented in having one power that is so strong that it's not clear exactly how it can be checked. That is a dilemma. It's a dilemma for the United States, and it is for Europe. And you're laughing. What are you laughing at?
I'm laughing also because your answer on France is so long. You are a real American, fascinated by France. You have to become a member of
they are fascinating.
One of these commissions.
They are fascinating.
But what I wanted to say is also Germany. I was personally very touched by Joschka Fischer, who was really dedicated to Madeleine Albright's ideas, who played an important role in Kosovo. Maybe he is a man from the 60s, but maybe he became a wise man from the 60s. How is it possible that you alienated a partner like Joschka Fischer, a man who also said to Rumsfeld in Munich, this Tagesbürgerkunde, how it was called, we are partners, we are not satellites of the United States. And I think that's something that must have made impression on you too.
Well, I mean, I think Joschka Fischer was a hero in Germany for taking Germany as far as he took it, for instance, on the Kosovo conflict. I do think, by the way, that Joschka Fischer did not agree with Gerhard Schroeder's political strategy during the campaign and would not have chosen the route that Schroeder took. Even though he may not have supported the war in Iraq, I don't think he was in favor of this essentially unilateralist position on the part of the Germans. But then, you know, there is this, we all know that there's a certain kind of, Kosovo was about Europe. I mean, this is the thing. Why were Europeans in favor of Kosovo, but they're not in favor of Iraq? Because after all, Saddam Hussein is as brutal a dictator with as much blood on his hands as Slobodan Milosevic. And maybe the murders weren't occurring at that moment, but they certainly had occurred within recent memory. And so the moral case against Saddam Hussein was absolutely as clear as it was against Milosevic, setting aside weapons of mass destruction and security. Why was Kosovo so important to Europeans? Because it's in Europe. Because completing the European project was impossible with a man like Slobodan Milosevic.
Baghdad is also 4 hour flying from here, so
it's not part of Europe, and Europeans don't consider it part of Europe. And the Europeans, let's face it, have never concerned about Iraq. Never have been concerned about Iraq.
Only for the oil, maybe.
Well, I don't make that accusation.
But we are concerned, I think, for problems on our frontiers. We are concerned of having a bad relation with the Arab world, and that's something the Americans maybe didn't understand.
What did because we want to have bad relations with the Arab world? Is that the American policy? I mean, it may be the unintended result of American policy, but it's certainly not the desire of American policy to have bad relations with the Arab world. I'm sorry, you can't convince me that the Europeans thought about the problems in Iraq the same way they thought about the problems in Serbia and Bosnia and the Balkans, which were about Europe. And I think it's entirely understandable. But I do find it somewhat, ironic that they, had so little concern for the human suffering of the Iraqi people for all those years. Now, by the way, America also had not a great deal of suffering, but when it came time to do something, I never understood why Europeans didn't see the moral case there.
If you can give us Europeans an advice, because we are now alienating from the United States, is it a good idea to have a strong European defense, one European uniform, things like that?
Well, I think it's a good idea for Europe to increase its military capacity. My preference is that it should occur within NATO. And if I were a European, I would actually use NATO as the means of influencing the United States. And I think that Europeans are missing a bet in not taking that opportunity. Because NATO is the one multilateral international institution that Americans still have a very high emotional attachment to. And it's an organization that operates by consensus. And so Europeans, if they take NATO seriously, that is a place where they can have influence over the United States. But if the only way Europe can build itself up a military power is by doing it within the European Union context, that's fine with me. But all I know is I've been hearing European promises to themselves to increase their military capacity for a very long time, and it doesn't matter whether it's part of NATO, against the United States, for the United States, it hasn't happened. But sure, that's my advice. Increase your military power.
Okay. Last question, and then I will go to the audience. A colleague of you, Joseph Nye, wrote a famous book, The Paradox of American Power. And it's interesting to confront your book with his book, because he sees American power in 3 stages: economical power, military, strategical power, and cultural power. And let's put it a little bit the way that economical power are all these companies. You have a lot of problems if you see it to Japan, to Europe. We are very strong economical power, as you have said yourself. The military side we have discussed already. The cultural thing I don't want to discuss too long, because not everybody in Europe likes McDonald's. But are you not too much focusing on the military, the strategical aspect in your book?
Yes. But
on purpose.
Well, yes, on purpose, because the reason I wrote this was I was trying to understand what it is exactly that divides Americans and Europeans. Why are we having these disagreements? And really, Americans and Europeans don't disagree about economics fundamentally. They have fundamental agreement on economic issues. They have fundamental agreement on soft power issues. It's on the issues of military power where they have the greatest disagreements, and it's the military power gap and the ideological attitude toward military power that is causing this ascension. That's why I focused on it, not because the others are unimportant. But I will say that the assumption that military power would be of declining utility in an increasingly globalized world, which was the assumption that was so current in the 90s, I think is wrong. And I think that what we've seen is that military power still is a very important element of international power. And also, if you ask yourself what power can be wielded, and this is my only argument with Joe Nye, a lot of this soft power is not something that you wield, it's just something that exists. Economic power is difficult to use for strategic purposes. You have economic power because people want your market, because your companies are strong, et cetera, but how do you use it to further strategic interests? It's not always so easy to do.
Okay, now let's not discuss too long on this issue. Now I would like to give the floor to the audience. Please, questions, no declarations. And there is the mic. And please say your name. And I see there the first finger. Waar, boven? Yeah, upstairs there's also one.
Yes, thank you. My name is Erik Povel. I work at NATO headquarters in Brussels. Mr. Kagan, will I be out of a job soon?
Do you want to be?
No. I still believe in it. But more concretely, what do you think the administration is going to do with France? Are you going to abolish the NAC and bring in the Defense Planning Committee? And secondly, I was struck by sort of the statement of 9/11 on this whole U.S. administration outlook. You tend to describe it as a long-term thing which was there all the time, and 9/11 was maybe exacerbated it. But, well, I think when Europeans, we see 9/11 as the fundamental change.
Okay. Please.
Well, there's no question that 9/11 had an impact on American foreign policy, but I really, yes, I insist that it did not fundamentally alter American foreign policy. It sort of took a trajectory that America's been on for a long time and put it on hyperdrive to some extent. I mean, you know, when historians look back on this whole Gulf issue, they're not going to begin this with 9/11. They're going to begin it with the first Gulf War, because the first Gulf War led, in some respects, I mean, bin Ladenism is a product of the first Gulf War to some extent. And so there will see, in general, a movement of the United States into the Persian Gulf in response to perceived threats or perceived aggression, which then had consequences which pulled the United States in deeper, which is exactly what happened in Asia. I mean, the United States was sort of messing around in Asia, and then Japan got annoyed, and then it attacked, and then we got even deeper into Asia. So, I think it's a mistake to think that the world changed utterly on September 11th, although it certainly had a big impact. On the future of NATO, I think that NATO has a future, and I'm hopeful, and it's not entirely wishful thinking, that this crisis may serve to reinvigorate NATO in the sense that it may remind some powers that they really do care about NATO. I mean, one of the interesting things has been, setting France aside, that I think the Germans have decided that they don't want, that NATO means something to them, and that they would like to preserve their institution and their role in the institution. As to France, I mean, you can't go to the DPC unless everybody agrees to go to the DPC, and Belgium won't always agree to go to the DPC, and not only Belgium, other countries won't either, so it's not really an option. I know the administration would like to abolish the NAC and go to the DPC, but I don't think it works.
And is it an idea maybe to reorganize the Security Council? It was a discussion a few years ago to kick out France, for example, and to put in India and Brazil?
Well, to be even more mischievous, what about having just an EU seat on the Security Council?
Okay.
If I were being really mischievous, that would be the proposal I would make, and watch the French veto the idea of an EU seat. Look, I'm not going to rearrange the deck chairs on the UN Security Council Titanic. I mean, I don't think that that's the question. I mean, there may be a way of improving the UN Security Council, but whether the UN Security Council functions or not still depends on whether the permanent members are willing to take action.
Next question, please. There in the back, I see someone. The mic is coming to you.
Name is Frank Pond. I've got a question. One of the issues I find difficult to understand is the talking about Europeans all the time. I think that's, having been in the US as a European, there are no Europeans in my view, and that's one of the issues that is underlying in some sense, the military problems of the Europeans. We're having troubles enough to become a European Union. And you can see that in the struggle between the small European countries against the big European countries. How does that influence the theory of the book?
Well, it was always the best criticism of the book of my whole argument that I'm generalizing about a Europe that can't be generalized about, and you have all these different countries with different histories and somewhat different attitudes, and I accept that. But I must say that I have found, living in Europe and talking to people in all these different countries, there is an extraordinarily common attitude toward all the issues that I've been talking about. I don't find that much difference in talking to Germans and French and Brits and Spaniards and Italians. I find that there is a general common European approach to things, and it's certainly reflected in the opinion polls. Now, there are variations within Europe, even if there's some agreement. I must say that the whole new Europe, old Europe dichotomy, which is one way of slicing Europe up, I'm not sure that it really exists. I'm a little bit skeptical that there really is a clear division between an old Europe and a new Europe. So yes, I plead guilty to simplistic approach in talking about Europe, but I still think that there is a validity to it because I think there is a fairly common European view.
So for example, you say a general common approach, but you know that in the education field we can't make teaching books for kids in Italy and in the Netherlands which are the same. You will never find it in the US.
I'm not saying Europeans are identical, and I'm not saying that there aren't different nations in Europe. I'm saying that on the subjects of international order and foreign policy and questions of military power and strategic issues, there is more commonality. Put it this way, Europeans have more in common with each other than Europeans have with Americans. There is a discernible European worldview, it seems to me.
Next question. Well, there.
My name is Michael Abramov. I read your book. I noticed that you didn't mention Japan at all. It's logical because it's about Europe and the US.
Right.
I know. Still, I would like your comment. They were both pacified by the US in the 45. Their defense spendings were be able to take away because the US did their defense. However, Germany opposed the war and was very anti-American these last months. Japan was supportive of the war. I would just like to see your comments on this.
No, and it's a very good point, and it's something that I've noticed in general, that the America's Asian allies were all supportive of the United States in the war, and I think there's a very simple explanation, which is they believe they live in a very dangerous neighborhood. Europeans believe they live in a very safe neighborhood, and they do, by and large. I was talking to several Australians that I talked to said, we have your worldview because we live in a very dangerous place. And certainly Japan feels threatened by China and North Korea, and South Korea feels threatened. And so they have their worldview is closer to that of the United States. And in Europe, the Eastern European worldview is closer to the United States because they are still thinking about the danger from Russia. They joined NATO to be protected against Russia, and they still have a more Hobbesian view of the world as well. So a lot of it has to do with the level of security that you feel.
Maybe there's upstairs a question. No, otherwise we go there to the back. I see a lady. Yeah. Achter.
My name is Joya Marini. I think one thing that distinguishes the Bush administration from former American administrations is this tendency towards unilateralism. And I think that also tends to get associated with the neoconservative philosophy. Do you see that as a significant break from former U.S. foreign policy, or is it just something that's been accelerated after 9/11?
Well, first of all, again, as one of the few neoconservatives in captivity, I don't consider unilateralism to be a neoconservative doctrine because I'm not a unilateralist. I would support unilateral action by default. If there's if something needs to be done and no one will do it with you, then I think that doesn't mean the United States shouldn't do it. And that Joe Nye agrees with me on that. So in that respect, I don't consider neoconservatism to be unilateralism. But there's no question this administration has been more unilateralist than past administrations, and there are a lot of reasons why that's true. One is that the original foreign policy doctrine of this administration came out of the sort of quasi-neo-isolationist republicanism of the 1990s, and so the general approach was we need to pull back from the world and not be so involved, and so that naturally led to a certain kind of unilateralism. Some of it is what I was talking about before. It's just a historical. It seems to me not surprising that after the Cold War ended and the multilateral imperative of the Cold War strategy ended too, that the United States would be generally a little bit more unilateralist. And then finally, and here is where the September 11th point is certainly true, September 11th made the United States very solipsistic. Americans became concerned exclusively about themselves, which was, again, not the Cold War paradigm. And so, again, I don't think it's surprising that there's been greater unilateralism by any administration that was in power at this time. And so you put all those things together, and yes, you have a more unilateralist
But
administration.
in addition to this lady, is there not the possibility of arrogance, a tendency of arrogance in the American policy, and a danger of arrogance?
What?
It doesn't sound familiar to you.
I have to say, on balance, again, living in Europe, there's plenty of arrogance on all sides. I don't know that the arrogance...
The French.
Well, I'm not even just... arrogance is not an American monopoly, I don't think.
Please. Yeah. Next question. There in the back, I see someone.
You discussed several ways in which Europe could influence America. And you mentioned the Chirac way and the Blair approach, and you clearly referred to the Blair approach. However, if a European view, rightly or wrongly, is not to go to war against Iraq, is it a good way influencing America into that direction by joining the American forces? I wouldn't think so.
No, you're certainly right.
The Blair approach is right if you agree with America, but if you don't agree, which is the right approach then?
No, obviously. No one should do something that they think is the wrong thing to do. But I guess if you look at it, if you step back a little bit, I was just thinking, if you step back a little bit and you think about European strategy toward the United States, Now, I think the United States was going to go to Iraq no matter what Europe did. So you weren't going to stop the war anyway. So the question would then be, let's think beyond the war to how do you try to get the United States now and in the future to try to get it to abide as much as possible by an international order which doesn't necessarily serve its interests. If all you're thinking about is the war, then you're right. Then there's no question about it. But if you decide that America's going anyway, so now how do we deal with the situation, then I think the Blair approach is better. And I think that it's entirely conceivable that Chirac could have expressed his opposition to the war, but nevertheless, at the end of the day, participated. I think many in the French government thought that that was what was going to happen. But you still would have gotten the United States to come to the UN Security Council, get a resolution, and set a precedent for the future. So I agree with you. In one respect, you're right. But in another respect, maybe a little bit of more nuanced, longer-range thinking might have led you to the Blair approach.
There, another question. And then we go to that side.
My name is Bob van Hengel. I have two remarks. Chirac is not well known for his principles. And secondly, I think it may suit the American power idea that the European community is not a very strong military power. I mean, that's something I crossed my mind for some time. But the point I wanted to make is I think I cannot believe that the importance of having military power is to combat terrorism. I mean, it happens to play a role in the discussion now, but that's not the real reason. And I think having military power for the United States is certainly not directed to control Europe. So I think I was interested in your answer to the question, what is the reason for the strong military power for the United States to maintain at this time? Personally, I would think this is probably China, but just very interested in your opinion on that.
China.
Europe, and in fact, I don't think is really relevant in this respect.
No, I don't think the military power is aimed at Europe. I agree with you. And I also agree with you, by the way, that the military power is not just for the purpose of fighting terrorism. I mean, that's just the latest, issue, and I don't think that we're going to be spending the next 50 years talking about fighting international terrorism. I'm hoping that's true, but I'm also guessing that that's true. No, I mean, military power is basically for the reasons that we've always understood it to be. It is obviously plays a critical role in maintaining stability in East Asia, which is an increasingly unstable region. There is the rising power of China, which is going to force adjustments which are going to have to be made, and they're going to be difficult adjustments. Then there obviously is the problem of the Korean Peninsula as well. I mean, someone once said that Asia's future is Europe's past, and there is, I think, some truth to that. So we're heading down that road. I think, though, that clearly in the Middle East, and we are in a period of instability that is not ending anytime soon. And I think that there is a need for military power there, as deterrence, or on rare occasions, perhaps as more than deterrence. So, and then there's the general reason why I think it's important for a country like the United States to have military power, which is to deter in general those who might wish to upset an international order that we all enjoy and that we all support ultimately. I mean, the existence of the United States as a very powerful nation is itself a deterrent, which shouldn't be taken for granted. It's a deterrent to those who might think that if they built up enough military capacity, they could reorient the international system in such a way that would benefit their interests.
Question there.
My name is Paul Holle, and I would like to ask how the Israeli-Palestine conflict does fit in your observed divergence between Europe and the United States.
Well, I carefully avoided that subject in the book. Because it's tempting to fit it into this paradigm, because Israel is a country that is using military power on a regular basis. And is from the European point of view, is quite atavistic in its approach to military power. I've heard many Europeans make the point, as Chris Patton once did, that we Europeans, he wrote a letter to the Israelis, which I thought was interesting. He wrote a letter saying, "We Europeans understand what it's like to have ancient hatreds, but look how we put them beside us. So why can't you put your ancient hatreds beside you too?" This was a friendly Chris Patton letter to the Israelis, which I somehow think the Israelis didn't appreciate very much. But I think it fits into that paradigm. But the reason I didn't want to touch it is because there's also so much more going on in the Israeli-Palestinian dispute and the way it divides Americans and Europeans, which is not just about the power issue. I mean, American attitudes towards Israel and Palestine are almost diametrically, American public opinion attitudes are almost diametrically opposed to European public attitudes. It has nothing to do with which administration. I mean, this is the one finding of the German Marshall Fund poll of last summer, that Americans are much more supportive of Israel, much less supportive of Palestinians, and the European views are exactly the opposite. And why that should be so has to do with our different relationships with our own Muslim populations, the different level of influence that the Jewish populations exert in our various countries, and God knows what else. So it's a very complicated issue.
So, but maybe you can say something about this roadmap issue.
What would you like me to say about it? I mean, I think it seems to me perfectly obvious that there is a desire on the part of President Bush. There's clearly a desire on the part of Tony Blair, who has influence over Bush, to try to push forward progress on the peace process. I think the day will come not too soon if Yasser Arafat and Abu Mazen can work out their difficulties, when the roadmap will be published, and then we'll be off to the races and we'll see where things go. I do think somehow, though, I find Europeans somehow believe that the United States can wave a magic wand and deliver Israel whenever it chooses to do so, and I think that's wrong. It's absolutely not the case. The thing that has elected Ariel Sharon and keeps Ariel Sharon in power is not the great charm of Ariel Sharon and not his winning political strategies. It has been suicide bombings in Israel, which have radicalized the Israeli electorate and made them unwilling to take chances which they otherwise are willing to take, in my view. And so it is critical, it seems to me, no matter what anybody hopes to accomplish, that an end be put to these bombings, because that will free the Israeli electorate to do what I think they want to do, which is come up with a peace settlement.
Next question, there.
Hi, good evening. How much is the U.S. tax... Oh, sorry, Jan den Hartel. How much is the U.S. taxpayer willing to pay for this vast arsenal of military power? It's apparently far more than the Europeans are willing to pay.
Well,
obviously,
they are willing to pay a lot more than the Europeans are willing to pay. And, but if you look at it in historical terms, and the United States took a peace dividend also at the end of the Cold War, but it wasn't nearly as great a peace dividend as the Europeans took. At the end of the Cold War, the United States was spending roughly 7.5% of its GDP on defense. Today, it's spending roughly 3.3 or 3.4% of GDP on defense. The question of whether the United States can sustain spending 3.4 or even 3.5% of its GDP on defense seems to answer itself. Of course they can sustain it. But 3.5% of the American gross domestic product is $400-500 billion a year. So the answer is that is something that is sustainable, I think, over time. And I was interested to see that Paul Kennedy, who was the inventor of the term imperial overstretch, and who was writing about the dangers of American imperial overstretch in 1987, when the United States was spending 7.5% of its GDP, now says that the United States can maintain this level of military spending indefinitely, unless there's some catastrophic shock on the American economy.
I have to apologize. It's time for the last question, and let's go to that side and the man with the newspaper.
Hi, my name is Andrew Spence. I'm neither an American nor a European. I'm from Canada. I won't ask about American-European relations. I have a question about United States policy towards North Korea, which you touched upon briefly a few moments ago. I mean, in light of the sort of greater readiness and willingness of the United States to use and resort to military force, which is in your book and also been evidenced recently, I mean, do you think the United States will accept a North Korean nuclear power, North Korean nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula? Or do you think that after losing their patience with diplomatic niceties, the United States is quite prepared to resort to military force, subject only to military calculation on the Korean Peninsula?
Well, it's a very good question. I thought you were going to ask me a much harder question, was what is U.S. policy toward Canada? So I'm relieved that you only asked me about North Korea. No, it's a very good question. It's a very serious question, and my honest answer is I don't know. My instinct tells me that, first of all, North Korea already has nuclear weapons. And my instinct also tells me that North Korea is determined to continue its nuclear program, regardless of what the United States does. And so it is literally the case that either we're all going to have to learn to live with North Korea's nuclear weapons, or the United States is going to have to undertake some military action, which is an extremely unattractive military option. I mean, one of the arguments for why it was necessary to deal with Saddam Hussein now was that we didn't want him to be in the situation 5 years from now that North Korea is in now, with actual nuclear weapons that can be used in a conflict. Not to mention the fact that the damage that North Korea could do even with its conventional forces on South Korea is quite substantial. So I've heard a lot of people talk hawkishly about North Korea, but I've never heard any of them tell me what their military option is. Which doesn't say that there's no chance in the world that the United States will undertake military action against North Korea. I think it's a possibility, but I guess I think that the bad news is that this cat is already out of the bag, and that we're all going to have to adjust to an unfortunate reality. It's one of the great failures of our global non-proliferation strategy, and perhaps a lesson for the future.
Well, Bob Kagan, we are happy to have you here in Amsterdam. There were no demonstrations like in Spain, but I'm happy that I have met for one of the 6 neocons of the United States. I wish you a safe trip back to the planet Mars. Jan Hoekema.
Thank you very much, Leonard. Well, Robert Kagan, you are one of the real neoconservatives, and you surely delivered our expectations tonight. And there's hope, I think, because in the end, first of all, you are a friendly person, and you're a kind guy. And secondly, you delivered us some hope on the future of American-European relations. Because when I read your famous quotation about Americans coming from Mars and Europeans coming from Venus, I was reminded of a book I got a few years ago when I was a member of the parliamentary fraction of D66. A female colleague of mine gave me the book Women from Venus, Men from Mars. And it was given to me because I probably had too little gender sensitivity. The book had as its basic thesis that there was a gap which could not be bridged between men and women. I think you made clear to us tonight, and especially also in your book, that the gap between Europeans and Americans can be bridged. In an article in HP De Tijd, HP De Tijd, Time, you were characterized as, quote-unquote, more modest than your publisher. Well, perhaps that says more about your publisher, but I think you made very immodestly clear that there is a problem between the United States of America and Europe, but there is still hope. It's written in your book that there is, and I quote now from your book, a community of interests between Americans and Europeans. And I think this is the element we should try to keep in mind when we look into the future. There is still hope for the Atlantic Alliance. There is still hope for Europe. So I think, and that's my personal conviction, that there is hardly a future for power without law, and there's hardly a future for law without power. And if we take these two basic elements together, there is, I think, a common challenge for the United States and Europe to bring together, even in this time when power is under pressure and when law is under pressure in the aftermath of the Iraq war, there is a future for shaping the international order. The international order is under pressure. We have seen a shift in international law in the last few weeks. There is a problem where American power and European attachment to law clash together. We should not deny that. So we have a big problem before us. But I think the only solution to bridge that gap in the Security Council of the United Nations in the world relations is that the United States and Europe come together and bring power and law together into a framework of a new shaping of international law. Thank you very much for giving us some insight on American neoconservative thinking. It's less evil than we thought, but we have to...
Sorry to disappoint you.
No, you have not disappointed us. There is still some hope. Thank you very much for being with us. As a token of our gratitude and our pleasure of you being here, we have on behalf of the Atlantic Commission, the John Adams Institute and the Busy Bee Publishers, can I call this like that? That's the Bezige Bij uitgeverij. We have a small present which is, as always, applicable to the occasion. It's a CD with music called The Planets by Gustav Holst. I'm not sure whether it's a brother of Johan Holst, but anyway, it's Gustav Holst. I'm not sure from which country he is originating, including Mars, the bringer of war, and Venus, the bringer of peace. I suppose the Americans are the bringer of war, and Venus is Europe, the bringer of peace. I'm proud to be a European, and I hope to be able to cooperate with you Americans to bring peace to the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.